So the only thing I think that's probably a little more unusual than preaching your pastor's sermon when he's out of town is preaching your own sermon when he's here. Here we go. I'm not sure that the date was planned this way on purpose, or if by people who schedule such things, or if man's collective sin is just such that it gives ample example, or God's providence, and truthfully it's probably the first two as a consequence of the third, right? But it was a pretty big day this week. It was the anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan, and VJ Day. And so instead of our usual forays into the land of Narnia and C.S. Lewis, of which we've done quite a bit lately, we're going to just rewind and go back into history, especially for those younger among us that may not have been there. After the surprise attack at Pearl Harbor, the war with Japan had been raging for about 4 years. U.S. casualties were 108,000 deaths, 208,000 wounded. The Philippine Protectorate, who's a U.S. ally, their casualties were high and their population was devastated. Military losses for them were 27,000 dead, 75,000 living POWs, and an unknown number of wounded. Between 500,000 and 1 million Filipino civilians died due to war-related shortages, massacres, shelling, and bombing. Those numbers are so big they barely mean anything to us. The Chinese Daily, which was a state-run newspaper at the time, estimated their dead to number around 35 million people due to the war with Japan and the subsequent occupation. The death and destruction had to stop. On August 6th, 1945 at 8:15 a.m., the first nuclear attack in the history of the world went forward with an atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima, immediately killing 70,000 people. President Truman then made this announcement. We are now prepared to obliterate more rapidly and completely every productive enterprise the Japanese have above ground in any city. We shall destroy their docks, their factories, and their communications. Let there be no mistake, we shall completely destroy Japan's ability to make war. It was to spare the Japanese people from utter destruction that the ultimatum of July 26th was issued at Potsdam. Their leaders promptly rejected that ultimatum. If they do not now accept our terms, they may expect a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth. Behind this air attack will follow sea and land forces in such numbers and power as they have not yet seen, and with the fighting skill of which they are already well aware. Because of the failure of the Japanese to surrender after that address, a second bomb was dropped on the city of Nagasaki 3 days later. An estimated 40,000 people were killed in the blast. Those were terrible decisions, made in terrible times, with perhaps even more terrible alternatives. I really don't envy anybody sitting at those tables as they were made. But it worked. The Japanese surrendered on September 2nd, paving the way for Allied occupation and a peace with the U.S. that has developed into one of our country's closest alliances. While the Pacific theater of World War II has been quelled and peace with Japan persists to this day, mankind has obviously not been idle in the fields of war. Even looking at the United States alone, while World War II technically was the last time we declared war on another country, we've had plenty of other skirmishes and conflicts. Without Congress's approval, it's not technically war, but Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, not to mention the proxy wars that have been fought, the war on drugs, the war on poverty, the Cold War, the trade wars. The list goes on and on. Humanity in our inborn sinful nature without Jesus is not a creation of peace, although we were created for peace. So we've been reading this book, right, by R.C. Sproul called The Holiness of God. And he gives 3 examples this chapter on war with a holy God. Actually, he gives 4 examples, but this is a sermon, so we're using 3 examples. Of biblical characters who fought with God, each in their own ways, but with similar results. We'll look at today at Jacob, who literally fought God physically, Job, who wars intellectually with God, and Saul, who tried to just annihilate the people of God with violence. He dedicated his whole soul to war with God. So let's start with Jacob. Jacob's an interesting dude. Raised as the grandson of Abraham, he no doubt understood the promise that the big A got from God himself, right? So that being said, he probably would have been around campfire stories hearing about Abraham and God's interactions, but that olive has fallen far from the tree, as they say. Let's look at the resume. First of all, his name literally means supplanter. So my name, James, means usurper. So I kind of can relate to the whole being judged by your name thing. He makes good on that, though, then by entering a conspiracy with his mother, conning his brother to deceive his father, to literally rob the blessing of God from his brother. Then, while on the run from his brother, because he fears his life, because who wouldn't in that situation, God gives him a dream on his way to Bethel. So we'll go to Genesis 28 here. He had a dream in which he saw a stairway resting on the earth, which its top reaching to heaven, and the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. There above it stood the Lord, and he said, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac. I will give you and your descendants the land on which you are lying. Your descendants shall be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west and to the east, to the north and to the south. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. I am with you and will watch over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back into this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. Now, Jacob's ladder is cool. There's a whole lot to talk about potentially with Jacob's ladder and speculate on. And if that's your jam, the next time it's mentioned is John 1. But I'm going to resist the temptation, and that's going to be homework. Jacob, though, was this secular guy chasing health, wealth, and all the world had to offer. What he discovered was a predictable result that he didn't predict. Alienation from God, alienation from his extended family. Now that God blessed him, all was going to be cool, though, right? Like God says, lots of blessings through you, life's going to be good. Not quite yet. He's cheated by his father-in-law in this weird, wife for work times 2 scheme that he gets himself involved with. And then he's cheated again by the same guy out of his wages and a lot of his property. There's a whole thing with breeding sheep and black and white sheep. So he wisely, probably, decides to part ways with his father-in-law times 2, and figures he better make right with the brother he cheated in the same way he was just cheating. So, this guy wants to kill him, he wants to go make right. Or he thinks he wants to kill him. So what's he do? He does what any of us would do. Line up all of his property and march it towards Esau. I don't know why the parade. Did he think that Esau would be impressed with his wealth? Did he think that his brother would kind of tire out, killing and maiming everybody in front of him? So when he got there, his rage would be spent? I don't know. But how would you like to be the guy in the front of the line who has to walk the sheep in? Yo, Joe, we got your employee review in this year, and it's not looking so good. So we'd like you to be in the front of the parade. So Jacob settles down on his rock pillow for the night while this parade is marching out. And Genesis 32 tells us, after he had sent them across the stream, he went over all of his possessions. So Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip, so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. Then the man said, "Let me go, for it's daybreak." But Jacob replied, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." The man asked him, "What's your name?" "Jacob," he answered. Then the man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you've wrestled with God and with men and have overcome." Jacob said, "Please tell me your name." But he replied, "Why do you ask my name?" Then he blessed him there. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "It is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared." So let's pause the preaching stuff that I'm like amateur at and move into something I know pretty well: the hip. Check out this slide. Okay, but seriously, when we talk about the hip, and this is a pet peeve, so like I don't have to deal with this anymore after I give this little lecture. So the hip joint is not here. When your hip hurts, this is not your hip, okay? Look at the screen. Where the joint is here. Your groin is your hip. So back to the preaching. God essentially is saying, you know that promise I made about kids? How miraculous will I have to be to accomplish that promise? He punches him in the groin, and Jacob walks with a limp for the rest of his life. Borrowing a little bit from Bible Project there, but they go into the Hebrew about it. Yeah, that's essentially what happens. So Jacob loses his war with God, but even then tried to grasp some concession. So let's talk about names here. So submission in that period of time was really related with giving your name. When you gave your name to somebody, or somebody changed your name, they were showing power over you. They were showing conquest over you. And so, did you catch what happens at the end of this? Jacob loses, but he tries to get a little bit of negotiation. He tries to grasp a little bit of victory from defeat when he asks the angel's name. He's trying to rescue some pride. And so what can we learn from God's response? I'll borrow from Sproul, who we're reading out of. He says, Jacob, now Israel, politely asked the angel's name, did not get it. This was the final act of divine conquest. There were no draws with God, no split decisions. When we wrestle with the Almighty, we lose. He's the undisputed champion of the universe. The Christian walk is often one of struggle with God, sometimes a struggle that lasts through the night and into the morning. We must have times of struggle through the night if we're to truly understand the sweetness of the soul's surrender. So a rapscallion gets his dues when he gets hip punched by the angel of the Lord. Bad guy gets his, story ends in submission. Point, set, match. This fits the narrative of like every action movie I've ever watched, and I've watched a lot of them. Some I'll admit to, and some not so much. So that's an easy one for us to grasp, the appropriate of his submission. But what happens when the man in this situation is a just one? When he suffers, and the war is one of the intellect, of the mind. Enter Job. Job suffered. He suffered perhaps more than almost anyone else in history. His possessions were destroyed. He lost his family to death. He has boils, sores all over his body. He reminds me of like one of those, like a refugee, basically, or one of those like really sad commercials with the sub-Saharan African kids and the rich celebrity who's asking you to send their money to the rich celebrity. Yeah, I don't know. Anyway, so that's what I think of when I think of Job, though. And we have to remember, it is hard to have faith when you're suffering physically. There's a tie between the body and the mind that way. But even through all of that, in chapter 13, Job says, though he yet slay me, yet I will hope in him. Talk about long suffering. But like all of us, though, Job has his limits. About 18 chapters later, his tune kind of changes somewhat. Oh, that I had one to hear me. Behold, here's my signature. Let the Almighty answer me. And the indictment which my adversary has written, surely I would carry it on my shoulder. I would bind it to myself like a crown. I would declare to him the number of my steps. Like a prince, I would approach him. Do you see how Job has thrown the intellectual gauntlet down? He challenges God's divine justice. I think the kids would say, shots fired, right? Let the Almighty answer me. I know it's speculation, but I always like to cast biblical stories in my head like a director, right? So when I hear Job in this moment, I picture him on his knees, wearing rags, the dust swirling around, the camera shot coming from the top, with him arms outstretched, just screaming at the heavens. The only moisture in the scene is the tears coming from his eyes, right? A man brought low by loss, grief, poverty, pain, death. Have you been there? Feeling persecuted by God, life not going your way, not getting what you think God owes you in terms of health, wealth, pleasure. Our intellects, tainted by sin, so easily tell our hearts that God owes us, that he's unjust for not giving us what we think he should. Our minds in this way go to war against a holy God. In a similar response to what we saw with Jacob, when God wages war, he wages war to win. Whether it's a physical challenge against his person or an intellectual challenge against his character. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, who is this that darkens my counsel by words without knowledge? Dressed for action like a man, I will question you, and you will make it known to me. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determines its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched out the line upon it? On what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone? When the morning stars sang together and the sons of God shouted for joy. Or who shut in the sea with doors when it burst from the womb? When I made the clouds its garment and thick darkness its swaddling band, and prescribed limits for it, and set bars and doors, and said, thus you shall come and no further, and here shall your proud waves be stayed. There's a lot more. God goes on for a total of 71 verses. 2 whole chapters. When God reminding Job of his insignificance when compared to eternity. You see, apart from the value that God elects to bestow him, us, everyone, we really have none. And Job was reminded of that in a conquering type of way. All this reference to the creation. When you go back to the creation, God actually tells Adam the same thing. From dust you were born. Dust you will become. Ironically, it's a theme also that Paul picks up in Romans 9. Will what is made say to its molder, why have you made me this way? Has the potter no right over the clay to make out of the same lump one vessel for honorable use and one vessel for dishonorable use? Our size and scope relative to a holy God is one of the hardest pills for contemporary American Christians to swallow. To clarify, though, God does not abjectly refuse to answer Job. He merely requires that Job answer first. And Job flumps the again. In fact, what's Job's response to this war of minds? He understands. He gets it. Behold, I am of small account. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand on my mouth. I've spoken once and will not answer twice, but I will proceed no further. That's Job 40. He acknowledges his defeat and his utter conquest by God in the war of minds. No prisoners taken, no quarter given. Our last object lesson, as we explore kind of why war with God is a bad idea, comes from the New Testament. You understand there was this cult that had sprung up, and this cult was gaining followers, okay? And this was happening in the Middle East. And thankfully, there was this super zealous guy who was going around trying to shut this cult down, right? He wanted, the piece of his own definition kind of to reign supreme. He dedicated his whole being toward the war against this perceived threat. His name was Saul. The place? Jerusalem. And who was he waging war with? Infantile Christianity, right? According to his own account in Acts. This is what I did in Jerusalem. Not only did I lock up many of the saints in prison, having received authority from the chief priests, but also when they were being put to death, I cast my vote against them. And as I punished them often in all the synagogues, I tried to force them to blaspheme. And being furiously enraged at them, I kept pursuing them, even to foreign cities. So Saul was traveling to one of those foreign cities called Damascus. And on the road, he was probably celebrating victories over his enemies and plans for how he would continue to conquer. Of course, God was not about to let his people be destroyed in their infancy. He's the victor of all things. So he goes on to tell us, "At midday, O king, I saw on the way a light from heaven, brighter than the sun, shining all around me and those who were journeying with me. And when we had all fallen to the ground, I heard a voice saying to me in Hebrew dialect, 'Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? It is hard for you to kick against the goads.'" Those were like spikes if oxen kicked against them, it would hurt. So it's stupid to kick against the goats, was kind of the point. And I said, "Who are you, O Lord?" And the Lord said, "I am Jesus whom you are persecuting. But get up and stand on your feet. For this purpose I have appeared to you, to appoint you a minister and a witness, not only to the things which you have seen, but also to the things which I will appear to you, rescuing you from the Jewish people and from the Gentiles to whom I am sending you, to open their eyes so that they may turn from darkness to light, from the dominion of Satan to God, that they may receive forgiveness of sins and an inheritance among those who have been sanctified by faith in me." You see, the more zealous he was in his goals, the further in opposition to God he became. Now, obviously, God doesn't oppose righteousness, right? But that being said, he does stand against those who are self-righteous. Let's be real. That was the real fight Paul was fighting. It's the fight we all find ourselves fighting sometimes. He was trying to stack up his righteousness to meet God's righteousness. And that's a war that God will always fight. Always win. There was no warning, no whisper of a warning, no breeze, no shine. Sovereignly and powerfully, Saul was knocked to the desert for it. In this experience, Saul became Paul, just as Jacob became Israel. The battle was over. Saul struggled with God, and he lost. Here, like Isaiah, Saul received his call, his commission to apostleship. His life was changed, and the history of the world was changed. In defeat, he found peace. This struggle we have is really a struggle between God's righteousness and our unrighteousness, right? He's just, we're unjust. And like the vigilantes of divine justice that we are, we experience fear, anger, hostility towards a perfect and perfectly just God. And that seems like a pretty dire situation. Our souls impossibly fighting this war against God? I mean, what's the solution? Where's the hope? How can we find peace? I suggest you turn traitor. You see, after his conversion, Paul had a different outlook on this war. He realized that he was a captive soldier on sin's side, an infantryman in a slave regiment, a conscript. So I'm listening to this podcast right now by Mike Duncan. It's a really cool historical podcast if you're into that type of thing. My wife's not, but hopefully some people out there are. And it's about revolutions, right? All these revolutions that have happened in history. And we've gone through the English Revolution, we've gone through the U.S. Revolution, we've gone through the Haitian Revolution, the South American Revolution with Simón Bolívar, and really cool. But I've noticed these patterns in these revolutions, and one of the patterns I've noticed that I had a harder time understanding was in all of these revolutions, people are fighting against their own self-interest. Often, there are huge amounts of people who are fighting for their own enslavers and for their own oppressors. They fight on the side that wants to keep them down. So I've been wrestling with this question, right? Why? And because it makes no sense to me with the historical lens that we have. And the best things that I've come up with are that they have war fatigue and they have fear of change. Isn't that true of us? We're slaves to sin, fighting against the side that wants to bring us true peace and true freedom. We want those things, but fighting against our own nature is hard. And we don't always win the battles against our angers, our lusts, our greed, our addictions. And it just gets demoralizing to lose those battles. Sometimes it's just, frankly, easier to give in. That doesn't even include the fear of change. I'm literally in the business of trying to get people to change their lifestyles. And I won't ask for a raise of hands, but how many people follow their doctor's orders to the letter? Here's a hint. Doctors don't follow their own doctor's orders to the letter. All right? You all have seen me eat. So Paul shares this struggle, but he reframes it for us. He turns traitor against his side and joins God's side against his own sin. We'll jump to Romans 7. For we know that the law is spiritual, but I'm of the flesh. I'm sold under sin, for I don't understand my own actions. For I do not do what I want, but I do the very thing that I hate. Now if I do what I do not want, I agree with the law that it is good. So now it is no longer I who do it, but sin that dwells in me. For I know that nothing good dwells in me, that is my flesh. For I have the desire to do what is right, but not the ability to carry it out. For I do not do the good I want, but the evil I do not want is what I keep on doing. Now if I do what I do not want, it's no longer I who do it, but sin that dwells in me. So I find it to be a law, that when I want to do right, evil lies close at hand. For I delight in the law of God, in my inner being, but I see my members another law waging war against the law of my mind and making me captive to the law of sin that dwells in my members. Wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from this body of death? Thanks be to God through Jesus Christ our Lord. So then, I myself serve the law of God with my mind, but with my flesh I serve the law of sin. How do we make peace with the holy God? Through surrender. Abject, complete, groveling surrender. We need to act as though we understand the truth of our situation. We have been conquered. The strongholds of our hearts have been laid bare and leveled. The fields of our sinful nature have been salted, never to produce their wicked fruits ever again. We should not act as though we are negotiating our way out of a war of attrition, with both sides acknowledging that the war is not really worth the continued effort. Our God sent his Son to die in this war as its highest ranking casualty. He's dedicated to the victory of our souls. I'd humbly suggest that you give your life toward fighting on the right side of this battle. So it's through this relationship with Christ that we really obtain true and lasting peace. It's one of the fruits of the Spirit. And all believers will grow in those fruits as they grow in their relationship with a holy God. Not the temporary peace that we see in the world, but true, eternal, lasting peace that comes with the surrender to His will. Let's pray.